The town of Ravenshade had long whispered about the old puppet workshop at the end of Hollow Street. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, its sign faded beyond recognition. Yet, even now, children dared each other to press their ears against the door, claiming they could hear the faint sound of wooden joints clicking in the darkness. Elias Crow, the last known puppet maker of Ravenshade, had vanished mysteriously one winter night. Some said he fled, while others believed something more sinister lurked in his forgotten shop. Whatever the truth, no one dared step inside, until now. Daniel Moreau, a journalist obsessed with unraveling urban legends, had come to Ravenshade for answers. He had spent months researching Crow's disappearance, finding only fragmented tales of his final creation, an unfinished puppet that had never seen the light of day. One evening, Daniel found himself standing before the workshop, the air thick with dust and neglect. He pushed open the rusted door, its hinges wailing in protest. The room beyond was eerily preserved, as though time had been reluctant to move forward. Wooden limbs, lifeless eyes, and forgotten marionettes hung from the walls like silent spectators. As Daniel stepped further inside, a cold draft wrapped around him, carrying a whisper that sent a chill down his spine. He turned sharply, his flashlight flickering. On the far end of the room stood a workbench, tools scattered as if abandoned in haste. And there, draped in a tattered cloth, was something large, too large to be a regular puppet. With hesitant fingers, Daniel pulled the cloth away. Beneath it lay a puppet unlike any he had ever seen, life-sized, carved with unsettling precision. Its face bore an eerie resemblance to Elias Crow himself, its mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-speech. A sudden knock echoed through the empty shop. Daniel spun around, but there was no one at the door. Then, from behind him, came the sound of wood scraping against wood. The puppet's head had turned. Daniel staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Had he imagined it? Was it a trick of the dim light? He lifted his flashlight, its trembling beam sweeping across the puppet's face. The wooden eyes stared blankly ahead, unmoving. The mouth, slightly open, remained frozen. It hadn't moved. Daniel exhaled, shaking off the creeping unease. He was letting his imagination get the better of him. Still, the workshop felt wrong. The air was dense, carrying the scent of old varnish and decay. He decided to document everything. Taking out his camera, he snapped a picture of the puppet. Click. The instant the shutter went off, the atmosphere changed. A soft creaking noise, like aged wood bending under unseen weight, whispered from the darkness. Daniel turned, his heart hammering. Nothing. Just rows of half-finished puppets staring lifelessly from their perches. He turned back to the table. The puppet was now sitting upright. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had stepped back only for a second. There was no way. A sharp tap echoed through the workshop. Tap. Tap. It came from the corner of the room, where an old wooden cabinet stood, its doors slightly ajar. A shiver ran down his spine as he edged closer. His fingers barely brushed the handle when, thud, the cabinet doors burst open, sending dust and forgotten tools tumbling onto the floor. Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. His pulse thundered in his ears as he peered into the dark space inside. Something was there. A set of small, childlike marionette hands dangled limply from the top shelf. Their strings were severed, their heads tilted unnaturally. But one puppet, positioned at the very back, looked different. Its eyes weren't made of painted glass like the others. They were real. And they were watching him. A whisper slithered through the workshop, curling around Daniel like unseen fingers. "You shouldn't be here." The puppet on the table lurched forward an inch. Daniel bolted for the door, but as he did, he heard it, a voice. Not his own. Not human. "Don't leave. We need you." The door slammed shut. The lock clicked into place. He wasn't alone anymore. Daniel's pulse pounded as he yanked at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the workshop thickened, pressing against him like unseen hands. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. Then, movement. The puppet on the table shifted again. Not a clumsy, accidental tilt, but a deliberate movement. Its tiny wooden fingers twitched, its head cocked ever so slightly to the side, as if studying him. Daniel forced himself to breathe. "Who's there?" His voice came out unsteady. Silence. Then, a faint clicking noise, the unmistakable sound of wooden joints creaking. It was coming from the cabinet. Daniel turned slowly. The puppet with the real eyes still sat among the discarded marionettes, its lips slightly parted as though mid-speech. But something was wrong. Its head was no longer tilted. It was now facing him directly. His chest tightened. Every instinct screamed for him to look away, but he couldn't. The puppet's gaze held him in place, drawing him in. A whisper curled through the air. "He left us." Daniel's breath hitched. "Who?" No response. Just the gentle swaying of forgotten puppets hanging from their strings. The whisper came again, softer this time. "He abandoned us." Daniel swallowed hard. He knew who he was. Victor Orloff. The infamous Puppetmaker. The man who had vanished without a trace, leaving his creations behind. A new sound joined the whisper, a rhythmic tapping, like tiny feet pattering across wood. Daniel spun, lifting his flashlight, but the beam trembled in his hands. Shadows danced along the walls, and then, the puppet on the table moved. It didn't just shift this time. It stood up. Its wooden limbs moved fluidly, unnaturally, as if guided by invisible strings. It turned its head toward Daniel, the carved smile stretching wider than before. Then, in a jagged, jerky motion, it took a step forward. Daniel stumbled back, his heel hitting something solid. The cabinet. Click. His flashlight flickered out. The room plunged into darkness. Then, a child's voice, barely a whisper. "We just want to play." Something brushed against his leg. He wasn't alone. The puppets had started to move. Daniel's breath came in short, shallow gasps. His heart slammed against his ribs as unseen fingers brushed his leg. The whisper still lingered in the air, soft, childlike, and full of eerie longing. "We just want to play." His flashlight sputtered back to life, casting a weak, flickering glow. And that's when he saw them. The puppets, dozens of them, had moved. They no longer hung lifeless from their strings. They stood on the floor, in chairs, atop workbenches. Their carved eyes locked onto him, their delicate wooden fingers twitching with anticipation. The puppet from the table was closest. It tilted its head, its smile wider than before. "Stay." Daniel yanked at the door again, but it held firm. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't possible. It had to be a trick, some elaborate, hidden mechanism in the room. Maybe Victor Orloff had designed these marionettes to move automatically. Maybe the strings were still attached somewhere. But then, one of them blinked. Daniel froze. Wooden puppets didn't blink. A sharp creak came from the ceiling, and he instinctively pointed his flashlight upward. The rafters were lined with them. Dozens. They dangled from their strings, swaying ever so slightly. But their heads were all turned toward him. Daniel's knees threatened to buckle. He forced himself to move, stepping away from the cabinet, toward the workbench. If the door wouldn't open, there had to be another way out. A window. A trapdoor. Anything. Then, the puppet from the table reached for him. Daniel leapt back, knocking over a stool. It clattered loudly, but the puppets didn't flinch. They just kept watching. His fingers fumbled for his phone. He needed to call someone, anyone. But as he pulled it from his pocket, the screen flashed, distorted. 4:44 a.m. The numbers glitched and scrambled. His reflection in the screen warped, his face distorted, hollowed, like something was draining the life from it. Then the voice returned, a whisper so close it felt like it came from inside his own head. "He made us. He abandoned us. Now you will stay." The puppets moved forward. Daniel did the only thing he could. He ran. Daniel bolted toward the nearest workbench, his mind racing. The puppets shuffled after him, their wooden limbs clicking against the floor, their shadows stretching unnaturally in the dim light. His flashlight flickered, struggling to keep up with his erratic movements. He grabbed a rusted chisel from the table and brandished it like a weapon. "Stay back." His voice cracked. The puppets did not hesitate. The one nearest to him, a boyish marionette with hollowed-out eyes and a carved grin, tilted its head and lunged. Daniel swung wildly. The chisel slashed through the air, meeting wood. A sickening crack echoed through the workshop as the puppet's head splintered, rolling to the floor. For a moment, silence. Then, a sharp giggle, high-pitched and unnatural. The puppet's headless body kept moving. Its hands groped blindly, reaching for him, while its severed head lay still, its painted lips curling into a wider smile. Daniel stumbled backward, colliding with a shelf. Tools crashed down around him: hammers, nails, carving knives. A thin rope coiled around his ankle like a snake. Before he could react, it tightened, yanking his leg out from under him. He hit the floor hard. The wind rushed out of his lungs as he was dragged backward, toward the open-mouthed puppet that still reached for him. Desperation fueled his next move. He grabbed the chisel again, sawing at the rope around his ankle. The fibers split, and he kicked free just as the puppet's hand closed around empty air. But there was no time to rest. The other puppets were still coming. Daniel forced himself up and ran toward the farthest corner of the workshop. His eyes scanned the walls. There had to be a way out. A vent. A window. Something. Then he saw it. A door. Not the one he had entered through, but another, hidden behind a rotting curtain. It was different from the others. Smaller, older. And unlike the locked entrance, this one was ajar. A cold breath of air drifted from within. The puppets halted. They stood motionless, heads tilted, as if listening. For the first time since this nightmare began, they seemed uncertain. Daniel didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the door and shoved it open. The air inside was thick with dust and something else, something damp, rotting. His flashlight barely cut through the darkness. Then he saw them. Rows of unfinished puppets lined the shelves. Dozens, maybe hundreds. But these weren't like the ones outside. These were different. They were human-sized. And some of them breathed. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The room was suffocatingly silent, but he could hear something, a faint, rhythmic sound. Breathing. His flashlight trembled in his grip as he scanned the towering figures before him. The human-sized puppets stood eerily still, their carved faces half-finished, their limbs bound by loose strings. Some were missing eyes. Others had only half-carved mouths, their expressions frozen in a grotesque limbo between life and wood. And yet, they breathed. Daniel stepped closer. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He reached out with a shaking hand, pressing his fingers against the wooden chest of the nearest puppet. A heartbeat. Faint. Slow. Daniel recoiled. He stumbled back, knocking over a wooden stand. The crash shattered the silence, and the air seemed to shift, as if something unseen had awakened. The puppets twitched. Daniel's flashlight flickered. One of the puppets, a tall, faceless figure, stepped forward. Daniel's body locked up. His brain screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, like unseen strings were pulling him down. The puppet's mouth, a thin, unfinished slit, began to open. A voice, dry and splintering, rasped out. "Finish us." Daniel wrenched himself backward, gasping. The other puppets stirred, their unfinished lips moving in eerie unison. "Finish us. Finish us. Finish us." Daniel's foot caught on something. He crashed to the floor, his flashlight rolling away, casting wild shadows along the walls. From the darkness, a new sound emerged. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Daniel twisted his head toward the source, heart pounding. A figure emerged from the shadows. The Puppetmaker. Or at least, what remained of him. The man's skin was stretched too tightly over his face, his eyes nothing more than empty sockets. His fingers, long and splintered like wooden joints, twitched as he stepped forward. His mouth curved into a smile, unnatural and puppet-like. He had become one of them. Daniel scrambled backward, his breath ragged. The Puppetmaker's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Behind him, the unfinished puppets took another step forward. Daniel turned to run, but his body wouldn't obey. Something was holding him in place. His arms, his legs, they wouldn't move. Then he saw them. Thin, glistening strings attached to his wrists and ankles. They stretched upward into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness above. Daniel's breath came in short gasps. He wasn't in control anymore. Something else was pulling the strings, and it was making him dance. Daniel's body jerked against his will. His arms lifted, his legs bent, his movements stiff, unnatural. He tried to resist, but the unseen strings pulled harder. His breath came in ragged gasps as he was forced to take a step forward. Then another. The unfinished puppets watched, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The Puppetmaker stood in the shadows, his carved grin stretching unnaturally wide. "Every puppet starts as a person," he murmured. Daniel thrashed, trying to break free, but the invisible force controlling him was relentless. He felt like a marionette in the hands of a cruel master. The room around him shifted, the wooden walls seeming to warp and twist. The puppets, those unfinished, half-human things, began to move with him, their bodies twitching and convulsing like broken dolls trying to dance. "No, no, no. This isn't real." Daniel shouted, but his voice barely echoed. The strings tightened, pulling him up onto the wooden stage in the center of the room. The old, rotting planks groaned beneath his weight. And then the music started. A warped, slow tune drifted from an unseen source, like an old music box winding down. It was eerie, dissonant, wrong. Daniel's legs bent into a bow, his arms outstretched. He tried to fight, but his body refused to obey. The unfinished puppets mimicked his movements, twitching and jerking in the same unnatural dance. He could feel it now, his bones hardening, his joints locking. His skin tingled, the sensation like thousands of tiny splinters piercing through him. His fingers stiffened, the flesh growing colder. Daniel let out a strangled gasp. He was turning into one of them. The Puppetmaker took a slow step forward, his carved face twisting into something almost sorrowful. "I didn't want this either." Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He struggled to speak, to plead, but his jaw was locking, his lips cracking like aged wood. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." His body twirled, bending into impossible poses. He was no longer in control. The Puppetmaker reached out a hand, fingers splintered and sharp. "You'll be my final creation." Daniel's scream never came. His mouth froze, the last of his breath escaping in a single, choked whisper. Then, silence. His body stiffened completely. The strings released him, and he landed motionless on the stage. The other puppets stepped closer, their carved faces solemn. One of them, the one Daniel had first touched, lifted a trembling wooden hand and placed it on his shoulder. Then, in a hushed, hollow voice, it whispered, "Welcome." Daniel couldn't move. His limbs were stiff, his body locked in an unnatural position on the wooden stage. He tried to breathe, but his chest did not rise. His heart did not beat. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. The unfinished puppets stood around him in a silent circle, their carved eyes unblinking, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal sorrow. He wanted to scream, to fight, to claw his way out of this nightmare. But he had no voice. He was trapped. Not just in the workshop, but inside a puppet's body. He could still see. His vision was different now, limited, as if looking through painted wooden eyes. He could feel the grain of his carved skin, the delicate joints that had replaced his once living muscles. Somewhere in the darkness, the Puppetmaker watched. "You fought longer than most," he murmured, stepping closer. His hand reached out, fingers tracing the lines of Daniel's wooden face. But everyone succumbs in the end. Daniel wanted to recoil, to shove the twisted figure away. But his body remained still. The Puppetmaker tilted his head. "It's strange, isn't it? You still feel human. Still think like one. But you're not." His fingers trailed down to Daniel's chest. A long, Jagged crack ran through the wood. "You're breaking already." Daniel's mind screamed. The other puppets shifted slightly, their joints creaking. They knew what came next. The puppet maker turned away, moving toward the workbench. "Now comes the real test," he said, his voice almost hollow. Daniel strained, focusing every ounce of his will to move, even the smallest twitch. Nothing. His new body was unforgiving, unyielding. The puppet maker picked up his tools. A puppet is only complete once it has a master. He lifted something long and thin, strings. Daniel's vision blurred. A deep, unnatural dread settled into his carved chest. The strings hovered above him, waiting to be attached. He realized what this meant. He wouldn't just be a puppet. He would be controlled. Forever. The puppet maker took a step closer, lifting the first string toward Daniel's wrist. Daniel felt it before it touched him, a dark, creeping energy, like something trying to dig into his very soul. The other puppets watched in silence. The moment the first string touched his wooden wrist, pain exploded through him, an unnatural, searing agony, as if his very existence was being unraveled. The room seemed to spin, the walls stretching and twisting. The faces of the puppets blurred, their expressions twisting in silent despair. And then, something snapped inside him. A violent, uncontrollable force surged through him. And for the first time since his transformation, Daniel moved. The puppet maker's carved smile faltered. Daniel didn't know how or why, but his wooden body was no longer bound. His limbs shook as he lifted one stiff, trembling arm. The other puppets staggered back, their hollow eyes widening. The puppet maker took a step forward, his voice eerily calm. "That's not possible." But Daniel wasn't listening. Because deep within his wooden chest, beneath the layers of carved flesh and broken memories, something was still human. And it was fighting to get out. Daniel lunged. His wooden limbs were stiff, clumsy, but they moved, and that was enough. The puppet maker's carved smile did not return. His eyes, once filled with twisted amusement, were now wide with shock. "You shouldn't be able to move," he whispered. Daniel didn't care. He swung his arm, knocking over a workbench. Tools and wooden limbs scattered across the room. The other puppets flinched, their carved expressions twisting in something that almost looked like hope. The puppet maker recovered quickly. With unnatural speed, he leapt forward, pressing one gnarled hand to Daniel's wooden chest. Pain. Blinding, unbearable pain. A burning sensation tore through Daniel's body, as if his very soul was being pulled apart. The cracks in his wooden form spread, deepening. "You don't understand," the puppet maker hissed. "You belong to me now, and I do not lose my creations." Daniel screamed, though no sound came from his carved lips. His wooden body convulsed, the cracks glowing with a sickly blue light. The other puppets stirred. For the first time in years, maybe decades, they moved. Their stiff, lifeless bodies jerked forward, some collapsing to the ground before pulling themselves up again. Their glassy eyes locked onto the puppet maker. They were waking up. The puppet maker turned, his grin returning, this time filled with malice. "You think they will help you?" he asked Daniel. He took a step back, arms raised. "They are nothing but discarded souls. They exist only because I allow it." But Daniel felt something. A force deep within him, something he hadn't realized was there before. It connected him to the others. And they felt it too. The first puppet, an old man with a missing arm, lunged at the puppet maker, his wooden fingers scraping against the creator's cloak. Another followed. Then another. The puppet maker staggered back, his power slipping. "No," he snarled, his voice cracking. "I made you. I control you." But the puppets didn't stop. They moved with purpose, their bodies still stiff, but they were stronger than ever. Daniel, fueled by the growing energy around him, stepped forward. He could feel his wooden form breaking, but it didn't matter. He wasn't done yet. The puppet maker tried to retreat, but the puppets swarmed him, clawing at his robes, dragging him down. His once powerful voice became a howl of rage and desperation. Daniel grabbed a fallen carving knife. The other puppets held their creator down, their hands gripping him with a strength beyond the physical. The puppet maker's black eyes met Daniel's. For the first time, they were filled with fear. Daniel didn't hesitate. He drove the knife forward, right into the puppet maker's wooden heart. A piercing, unnatural scream filled the workshop. The walls shook, the shelves collapsed, and the twisted magic that held the puppets captive began to unravel. Daniel felt his wooden body tremble. His vision blurred. But he wasn't afraid. Because for the first time in this nightmare, he was free. The puppet maker's scream didn't fade, it shattered. It echoed through the workshop, twisting into something unnatural, something inhuman. The puppets froze, their wooden bodies trembling as the air around them cracked like splintering glass. The walls of the workshop writhed, the shelves and tools dissolving into black nothingness. Daniel staggered back, the knife still buried in the puppet maker's wooden chest. His body was breaking apart, but so was the nightmare that held them captive. The puppet maker clawed at his wound, his face contorting with pain. "No," he gasped. "You don't understand. Without me, you are nothing." Daniel knew that wasn't true. He looked around, at the puppets, their hollow eyes now filled with something more than just lifelessness. Awareness. Hope. The room shook violently. The workshop was collapsing. The puppet maker let out one last, ragged breath before his body splintered into dust, dissolving into the air like a dying ember. And then, silence. For a moment, Daniel thought he was gone too. His wooden body had begun to crack, pieces of him breaking away. But then, the air shifted. A cold wind rushed through the ruined workshop, carrying with it whispers, soft, distant voices. The voices of those who had been trapped here for decades. One by one, the puppets around him began to glow. Their stiff limbs relaxed. Their cracked wooden skin faded, replaced by the soft glow of something human. Their souls were finally free. Daniel felt a pull deep inside him, like something was uncoiling, unraveling the magic that had bound him to this cursed place. His body grew lighter, the weight of his wooden form fading. And then, a final snap. The world rushed away, like a door being slammed shut. When Daniel opened his eyes, he was no longer in the workshop. He was standing in the middle of the old town square, the very place where the puppet maker's shop had once stood. Except, the shop was gone. Not just abandoned, erased, as if it had never existed. The town looked normal. The people walked by, talking, laughing, living their lives. No one seemed to remember what had happened. But Daniel did. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer wood. His fingers, his skin, human. He was alive. For the first time in what felt like centuries, he took a deep breath. The other souls were gone now, free to move on. And yet, as he turned to leave the square, something caught his eye. A small wooden puppet sat on a bench near the fountain, its carved face frozen in a silent expression. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Because for just a moment, just a flicker, he thought he saw it smile.